Behind me are 4 garden beds. All of them their exact same dimensions. All of them are from the exact same company. All of them are filled with the exact same soil from the exact same landscaping company and was all grabbed at the exact same time. So the only difference between all of these is what is underneath the soil. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. Serious note, there are a bunch of different ways in which you can fill a bed for cheap. It kind of sounds pretty, doesn't it? And these range from wood, leaf mold, leaves, compost, manures, cardboards. It's literally endless. So what I did is I took what I gauged as probably the 3 most popular. The first one being wood, the second one being compost, and that's like regular garden compost, nothing else, just the cheap stuff that you make in your house or that you would get from maybe a local composting facility. And then cardboard. Now, my control is, of course, a bed that is entirely filled with just that soil. They all have the same amount of inches and soil, and the results varied drastically. And I'm excited to see not only what happens this year with these beds, but also looking at future years and how they perform later on. So let's go over each bed, look at the pros, the cons, and how they compare all together. Okay, so number 1 is the wood bed. Now, the bottom of the bed, like I said, is filled to the same height that the compost and the cardboard ones were filled to. What I will say is that the wood, when it was placed in, was actually placed on top of one of the braces. And because of that, it did pull the bed together. So that may be a con if you have lots of bracing or stuff going horizontal inside of the bed. It's not a huge deal. The bed's standing up just fine. It's just weird looking is all. And if you're into uniformity and have a little bit of OCD, probably not going to like that in your yard. Now, this bed performed very similar to the soil bed, both in the height of the tomatoes in particular, the overall volume of biomass within the bed. The water retention in this bed, however, was the lowest out of all of them, but I expect this to change as the years go on and things begin to rot. One thing I will say I didn't struggle with in this bed, but I have struggled in some of the other ones, and you are going to see, is a little bit of perched water table. So this one, because I used logs and I didn't use plywood or 2x4s, the uneven surface area and the fact that the soil kind of is jagged inside of the bed has resulted in no perched water tables and no signs of roots sitting in a perched water table space, which I really like. So overall, I think it is completely reasonable to fill half of your bed with wood. Now, besides the perched water table, and all these beds will, have that issue potentially, the other factor is the age of the wood. So the wood in this bed was about 3 years old, but that doesn't mean much in the world of decomposition inside of a soil ecosystem. Whenever you have material that is not composted or completely decomposed, there's a lot of nitrogen that goes into powering the decomposition process. Now, like I said, biomass was very similar in the soil one as it was in the wood one. And that's odd to me because I know there's nitrogen lockup in this, and I know the roots of the plants are sitting in spaces where nitrogen lockup exists. Now, I will say the soil bed didn't perform 110% either. And so because of the lower amounts of biomass in both, we could technically say that possibly the triple blend that I bought just didn't have fully composted compost potentially. And so that may be the reason for it. The other reason may be that the other 2 beds had way too much nutrients, and we'll show you maybe why that could be the case here in a little bit. Moral story, the older the wood, the better. I don't think personally that the wood itself and the age mine was at made a big difference. You could, if you wanted to expedite the process, would be to put in a lot of nitrogen fertilizer. Could curb the effects of really fresh wood interfaced with soil. The next bed is actually compost. So this one was interesting to me. 2 big things that I noticed. Number 1 is very elongated nodes, inner nodes, very elongated leggy plants, if you will. Now, I know that these are planted in shade, and if you watch my video on garden fails, you know that I'm less than impressed with the results of the sun, if you will, in this space. But relatively speaking to all the other plants that are in the exact same condition, the inner nodes are particularly longer and the plant is even more leggier in this bed. The reason, I think that there's too much nutrients, or there's an excessive level in particular of nitrogen, and this has caused a lot of growth. And that can mean very little flowers. It also can mean better susceptibility to disease and pests, because whenever you have excess nitrogen, you have nice soft green growth, and that soft green growth translates into an absolute buffet for your bug. Probably not the best in this first year. I guess we'll see what happens next year, but that excessive nitrogen would make me lean away from compost and would make me choose wood over the compost bed. Now, the other thing that I found very interesting, and this actually made me think of another Geek Crew member who actually brought this to my attention because she was having some issues in her garden and she used a lot of compost in it. She bought a lot of compost and it wasn't fully decomposed. So it was letting off a lot of heat, and this heat was causing damage to the plants that are planted in that space. Now, we got her over the hump. We got her through that heating process and kind of out on the other side. Garden ended up turning out just fine with a few adjustments that were made. My garden, I didn't have active decomposition by any stretch of the imagination. I just didn't have it fully cured, or there was a little bit of decomp still happening. It wasn't enough for me to notice. Like, I never felt any physical heat off the pile prior to putting it in here. But the reason why I know there's heat, or that this bed in general heats up much faster than the other three options, is because my lettuce in this bed, all lettuce was started at the same time, grown in the same greenhouse, same variety, bolted first. And so that means heat. Something got hot and warm, and considering this is in shade, how? Literally, how? So I'm gonna go with the heat combined with the excess nutrients made for a bed that looks very full, but not necessarily one that performs. Now, if you're going for a greenery vibe, if you're going for grasses and foliage, hostas, that sort of thing, maybe this is the choice you go with. If you're going for fruits, vegetables, or flowers, maybe not. Or be extra careful with what compost you put in, because it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much in the realm of not yet composted before you end up with a situation like that. Okay, so this is my favorite bed. I'm biased because I love soil. Soil science in the house. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Number one is that the growth of the tomatoes in this bed, excessive. Almost nearly as bad as, well, not quite, well, it's about a foot shorter, but also a foot higher than the wood bed. What that means is that there's too much nutrients potentially in the bed, and the first year is it wasn't gonna turn out regardless, because it had too much fertilizer or too much compost in the triple blend mix. Now, interestingly enough, this bed was the only bed out of all of them where I planted flowers. So I planted zinnias in all of these, and this one was the only one that actually physically is producing zinnias. So that was interesting. I don't know why. The only thing I could kind of chalk it up to would be if there was like a allelopathic inhibition within particularly the compost bed, possibly the cardboard bed, but I don't see how that's possible, and maybe the wood bed. Now, if it's not the allelopathy of the physical plant, the chemicals that the plants are emitting from the compost or the wood or the cardboard, the only other thing is that maybe these plants need a lot of nitrogen, and the nitrogen lockup that we found in the compost, the wood, and also the cardboard to an extent has resulted in obviously negative effects and therefore poor germination. So something to note was the only one that turned up with the zinnias. This bed was also the slowest to germinate seeds, and it was the slowest for my plants transplants to take off in. Now, the reason for that is because it is all soil, meaning there isn't much airspace in there. It's a loam triple blend mix, and so it holds a lot of water and it stays very cold for a very long time. It takes a while for this sucker to warm up. So because of that, the cooler soils resulted in more moisture retention, which was good for things like having a continual source of water, but bad because of the temperatures of the soil. And you guys know, if you've watched videos in the past, the transplant temp, the roots that you expose, the temperature you expose your roots to matters. That's why in cold climates, I'm now planting my tomatoes level with the ground because of the sheer size of the tomatoes I got off my garden this year that were planted above ground rather than sunk. That comes down to soil temp and also the temperature that the seeds need to be at in order to germinate. So wood, compost, soil, if I had to rate them, I would go wood, soil, compost. In the event I was growing in a space that was cooler, meaning in shade and or exposed to the prairies, you know, lots of airflow, that sort of thing, something not enclosed. That would be kind of the order I would go in. If you wanted to save money, just scrap the full soil bed entirely. However, if I was in the front yard, if I was in extreme heat, I would go with soil, wood, compost. But the question becomes, well, what about the cardboard bed? So the cardboard from this was from my excessive spending in the spring. The greenhouse came in cardboard. All these beds came in cardboard. All the Vigos came in cardboard. My trellis came in cardboard. I bought all that this year and I put it in the bottom of this bed. So luckily enough, it's also half full. So the wood, the compost, and the cardboard are all half full with the medium. Now, what I noticed with this one is my plants hit a perched water table. Now, the reason for that is because the cardboard was not shredded. It's very flat, so there was a very obvious interface between soil, cardboard, and then soil again. And because of that, the roots sat in damp space. Now, I wouldn't say it horrifically negatively affected anything by any stretch of the imagination, but I will say that it definitely mimicked kind of what the soil bed was doing, but not in the beginning of the season. It was fine in the beginning of the season because it was actually quite warm. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. But later in the season, when lots of rain started to hit, I noticed the plants were really pulling back on growth. I pulled out some of the bean plants and I very quickly identified root rot, and then I dug down and sure enough I had a little bit of a perched water table, particularly after long periods of heavy rain. Now, if you're not in an area with prolonged levels of heavy rain and you can control the amount of water going into this system, might be something that works for you. The temperature was comparable to the compost bed. I think it's because it's not because anything's decomposing. It's solely because there isn't much soil, and it's cardboard. It's corrugated cardboard, so there's lots of airspace and that sort of thing. So things heat up and cool down much faster than what would happen in a wood bed or in the soil bed. So because of that, I did also end up with bolted lettuce in this bed. I didn't in the wood, and I didn't in the pure soil. So that's interesting. Now, the other very interesting thing here, folks, is that my tomatoes in this bed produced the most tomatoes, and they're the shortest. Now, the tomato production, I'm gonna burst some bubbles here. I think it's because it was the one on the edge that received the most light bed-wise, so that kind of is a little bit of a oomph in my garden science. But the plants themselves and how short they were, I think comes down to the fact that I didn't have too much of that soil that had possibly, very likely, excessive levels of nitrogen. I didn't have the compost underneath, which was excessive nitrogen. And I had cardboard. And that cardboard was a nitrogen lock because it needs to decompose. Combine that with the fact that it had very rapidly fluctuating temperatures, and you combine that with the fact that I had the perched water table and I have some of the shortest plants in this bed, hands down, tomato-wise. So that is definitely interesting. None of these beds, because I did them properly, sunk. So the leaf one, I stomped it down, made sure it was nice and compact. The cardboard one, soaked, stomped down, all that fun stuff. So nothing sunk, everything remained at the same level. Now, before we get into what bed was the best in kind of the order from best to worst, all performed, but best to worst, I want to say why in this video you saw no soil testing. And the reason for that is because it's all the same soil. So right now, in this moment, in this first season, these beds are all going to test the same. The greatest amount of biodiversity and the best for transplants, seed germination, and everything else in between, along with the one that I would use if I was going to continue gardening into the fall and winter because of the stability and the temperature, is going to be hands down soil. Now, again, I am biased because I like beds that are full of soil, and I understand 100% how expensive that can get. Don't get me wrong, I understand, and I filled. That's the only bed, other than my 2 tomato beds, that is completely soil. Just a heads up, because I know how much it costs, and it's ridiculous. But if I had to choose, I would go in ground and I would go pure soil, if I had a choice. Now, with that being said, I would go for just a loam without all the compost junk in there. Unfortunately, you can't just go buy loams. They're all triple mix blends or like sand or clay. That's pretty much what you get at landscaping stores. So you have to go with a triple mix blend. And you're kind of at the mercy of what the landscaping company has done in regards to the compost. So that kind of sucks. Now, if I was to pick one of the ones that were filled as the best, hands down, this year, first year, this could change. This could change over time, over the years, it's going to change, guaranteed. In this moment, first year, cardboard. Things I would change in the cardboard bed is I would do shredded cardboard, less cardboard, or I would do cardboard and then kind of like a hole for the soil to sink in, similar to like what the logs would be. Cardboard, a little hole for the soil, just so that not everything's like, it's not playing flat and it is kind of variable, which would break up kind of that perch water table scenario. So definitely cardboard, because I didn't get that excessive leggy growth. And the only issue I had was the perch water table, which I could have solved had I not been very firm in the fact that I wanted everyone filled to the exact same height, because I think that's what typically everyone would do over the variability. If I had to pick my number 2 out of the half-filled beds, it's going to be wood. It's going to be wood. Now, again, this is first year. This may change as the wood begins to rot. I don't think it's going to. I think it's always going to probably be sitting. I think it's actually going to become the first, especially in a drought year, because of the water retention in a rotting wood being so freaking high compared to what the compost or the cardboard beds would do. That one I liked because, again, I didn't have excessive growth. My germination was kind of iffy in some places, but otherwise, I loved it. I messed up initially in putting the soil in and, bowing it in to an extent. That kind of sucked. But other than that, definitely second. The last one, and you guys are gonna be like, this woman just has a hate on for compost. I don't. Every time it's used in excess, my eyes glaze over and I'm just like, yeah, whatever. Do what you want. No. No. That bed, that setup in general has so many issues. We have the potential for allelopathic chemicals being released. We have the potential for nitrogen lockup. We have the potential for heat. We have the potential for pests and disease if it wasn't composted properly. We have the potential for seeds that if it hasn't been composted properly. We have potential for a perched water table, although I didn't experience that much in this, but depending on the texture of the compost, definitely possible. And all these things are difficult to solve in the moment once everything's put together. Very hard. You're kind of locked into whatever the heck is happening at that point, which is unfortunate. So, and if you want to learn more about how to use compost properly in your garden, you're going to want to check out this video here. And if you want to know what Google thinks about you, this one here. I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.